Testament reading is from Acts, chapter 9, beginning with the 36th verse. Now there was at Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she fell sick and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, entreating him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them. And when he had come, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him weeping, and showing tunics and other garments, which Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. Then turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, rise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and lifted her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days, with one Simon, a tanner. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So we're continuing in our summer series called Faces of Our Faith. We're looking week by week at some maybe more obscure characters in the Bible. This week we find ourselves in the city of Joppa. Today, this is still a port on the Mediterranean, Jaffa. It's the place, by the way, where Jonah went when he was hightailing it away from God in the opposite direction and caught a boat that we wished he hadn't caught. It's another day and another story. At Joppa, there is a woman who's a Christian there named Tabitha in Hebrew, and her Greek name is Dorcas. This name means gazelle. Nathan's son Carter was baptized at the 8:30 service. Now we have another child here. And, I've suggested to Nathan that if they have a girl, they should name her Gazelle. It's be a good name. Dorcas, Gazelle. And I love the way Acts 9 describes Dorcas, this gazelle. She was always doing good and helping the poor, right? Like, how would that be? At the end of your life, and they say, "Tell me about him, tell me about her." They said, he was always doing good and helping the poor. The key word in there, I think, being always. She was always doing good and helping the poor. I mean, we all do good for the poor sometime, right? Like Thanksgiving, Christmas, we have a little spasm of doing something for the poor, but Dorcas was always doing good and helping the poor. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said that the doctrine of the devil is you do good when you feel like it. We do good all the time. We help the poor all the time. Let's just face it, this is so interesting. People come to me sometimes and they say, "I feel hollow spiritually. I don't feel connected with God." I'm always embarrassed because we have such a pedestrian formula for how you connect with God. It's not like, go have a vision on a road. We never tell you that. We say things like, read your Bible every day, pray every day, and one of them is always do good for others. It works, this pedestrian formula. And let's be clear, we live in a culture that has drifted so far away from this. We live in a culture that when it comes to people in need, to people who are different, there's a meanness, there's a harshness. And everybody thinks that that's cool and just the right thing, but Christianity has not changed. Christianity has not changed. We're about always doing good and helping the poor. Dorcas dies, and Peter's about 10 miles away, and they hurry to get him because they know he's the great apostle, knew Jesus personally, saw him raised from the dead. And what I love in this is they rush to find Peter, and they bring him to where Dorcas has died, and they're weeping, and it says that they showed him the clothing she had made for them. She's a seamstress, right? This is interesting to me in several ways. One is, here you have a woman who dies, and the poor are grieving her death, and they're showing things that she had done for them. Like, I've thought about that. Like, at your death, like, who will show up for the funeral, right? Will it be a bunch of, middle, upper class people? Will Will there be any poor people who will grieve your death? Would the poor be able to show anything that you had done for them? It's like a Christian thing. Peter comes, he raises her from the dead. We wish that would happen all the time today. It seems like in New Testament times, God did a lot of that, so we would kind of see it and then believe Jesus really is the resurrection, and then have hope. As a point of personal privilege, I'll share with you this. Every year we have a meeting up at Lake Junaluska, our Methodist annual conference. It actually continued through this morning. I came back last night because the excitement was just too great to bear. So I came back, and I'm kidding about that. I'm only half kidding about that. One of the neat things that we do at annual conference each year, though, is we have a memorial service for clergy and their spouses who have died in the past year. I've preached this service before, but I've never been in one of the families, but I was this year. Lisa's mom died back in November. And in a way, it's hard. It's like having a second funeral. So yesterday, we shed tears again. But yet, it's important to do it there, because if you're a Methodist minister, this is kind of a sacred place, and it's a place where we've spent all our lives with other clergy and their spouses and friends. And so there was sorrow, but yet there was the reminder. You kind of forget this. You start missing somebody you've loved and lost, and you need the reminder in worship that she's with God. She's raised from the dead. God hasn't let her go for a nanosecond. Dorcas is raised from the dead, and then it says that Peter stayed with Simon the tanner. I love this in the book of Acts. The early Christians, it always tells what they did for a living, right? So Dorcas is a seamstress, and Simon is a tanner, and Paul is a tent maker. They were, when Christianity spread, as it did so rapidly in the early days, there weren't big church buildings where you could put out big, welcome signs, and hey, we have a pretty church and a great choir, a lot of services for you. No, they couldn't do that. As Christianity spread, it spread in the workplace. People go to the marketplace, and the tanner is talking to the tent maker, and they say, God, I believe in this Jesus guy. It's really changed me. It's really helped me. I don't think I could get by without that. A lot of times we lament the demise of Christianity in our culture, but if it's going to stay alive and be something, it's going to happen when just people out there in the world talk about it and share in some way what it means to them, I think. Dorcas was a seamstress. She worked with her hands. I've tried to think all this week of people working with their hands and what a treasure that is. I have my grandfather, Papa Howell's tools. I've got his planer, his little saw that he used. People working with their hands. There's so much in our church to love and be proud of, and one is we have a knitting ministry, and there are women who, nobody sees this, I don't think, much during the week. They come here and they knit. They knit blankets, and they go to people that are really sick. They go to people, they go to infants that have just been born. It's such a tender act of love. And I talked to some of them this week, and they told what that means to them. And they were talking about how it's great to be able to use your creativity for God. This, like, some patience and discipline is required. You don't just like make a blanket in 5 seconds, right? It takes a while, and that discipline, there's something therapeutic, but there's also something profound that I'm helping someone. I'm bringing comfort to someone through this physical discipline. One of our knitters is very attached to the Krosnor home that's up in the mountain. They're children who've faced horrible challenges, and they have a weaving ministry there. And one of the slogans that they use is "Mountains of Hope for Children in Need," like broken lives, but they're rewoven. It's amazing. I think about seamstresses. My first church out of seminary, Wesley Chapel Church up in Meisenheimer, Stanley County. When I got there, I wanted to get to know my people, so I discovered there were a band of women that had a quilting group. So I said, I shall come to the quilting group. So I went twice. First time I went, they said, we're going to teach you how to quilt. And the second time, they asked me not to come back. And it wasn't the quality of my knitting, it's that I pricked my finger and I bled on their quilt. It's hard. What those women did when Lisa and I left the church after I was their pastor for 5 years is they gave us a quilt. And it wasn't just any quilt. All the women in the church had worked in this, and each square of the quilt was some moment from our lives, like my graduation from Duke, Lisa's childhood dog, our first date. What a beautiful gift. It's like the answer to the question, if the house is on fire, what do you grab and haul out with you? Sewing. My grandmother, so interesting. Mama Howell was a seamstress. She didn't do that for a living, and she didn't do it as a hobby. She did it because she had to. She had a sewing machine. I remember my sister and I getting in huge trouble. It was one of those old sewing machines that had the pedals that made it operate. We were having a contest to see who could make it go the fastest. I was winning until Grandmama Howell came in and made us stop. But Mama Howell sewed her clothes, and she sewed her husband's clothes, and she sewed her children's clothes. She sewed her mother's clothes late in life. She had to do that. What tender love, right? Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, a Methodist, was a seamstress, and the day that she refused to give her seat up on the bus, this is pretty interesting. They asked her later, like, why didn't you give up your seat on the bus to the white guy? And she said, I had been sewing all day and I was tired. Like, I love that. Like, yeah, she was tired from sewing all day, but she was also tired of being mistreated, right? See, this is other dimension in this, I think. I was studying for this sermon. I was looking at seamstresses, and I thought, like, what is a guy seamstress? Is there a word like seamster? It's not a word. I was trying to figure this out. Like, how do you say this? Christianity's got this thing we need to own, is that there are traditional roles for men and women, and we're totally supportive if God calls people to traditional roles. But yet, we're totally supportive when God doesn't call people to traditional roles, or you're not squashed within that traditional role. Christianity does not support this kind of thing. I love the RBG, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie. And a couple times in the movie, she quotes Sarah Grimke, who was an early abolitionist and then an early activist for women's rights. And the saying, and she's, by the way, Sarah Grimke is the woman who's featured in Sue Monk Kidd's novel, The Invention of Wings, which is absolutely fabulous. And Sarah Grimke's saying, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg loved to quote, is this: I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks. Like, I love that. What is God calling you to? Like, not what are traditional roles. I'm into this. I go to the grocery store. I love God's called me within our family to go to the grocery store, but I inevitably run into older women from our church, and they have to say, my husband doesn't buy. Like, what is that? Like, is it jealousy? What is it? I don't know. We do what God asks us to do, and maybe if we could cross boundaries, we could discover new gifts and new people. Once upon a time, God, there weren't women who were doctors or ministers or all these things. What's God calling people to? So it's interesting. I did find a seamster, a man sewer. It's actually in literature. He was a weaver. His name is Silas Marner. Fictional character, but a lot of times fictional characters are truer than real people. George Eliot's wonderful novel, Silas Marner, they make you read this in high school, but it's a fool's errand. You can't understand this when you're 15 years old. You need to be 52 or 67 or something like that to make sense of a book like Silas Marner. Silas Marner is a weaver, and he was also a miser. So he wove, but then all the money that he made, he kept. He was a miser, and he was accumulating his money, and he was a total loner. And so he's got all this gold, and he's really proud of it. It's taken him years to accumulate it. And he comes home to his cottage one day, and the gold is gone. Somebody has broken in and stolen, and he is distraught. He thinks his whole life has been pointless. The gold is gone. He's just crushed. You can't imagine even going on. He's got to start over reaccumulating the gold. So as he starts, but then he comes home one night, and he's got his lantern, and he comes in the cottage, it's dark, and as he holds up the lantern, he thinks he sees the gold back on the floor. The gold is returned. He's so excited, so he puts down the lantern, and he plunges his hand into the gold, but as George Eliot put it, instead of hard coin, he felt soft curls. He gets the lantern, it's a little girl. And he can't figure out whose little girl it is, so there's nothing he can figure out to do except to take care of her. So he takes care of her, and here's the way George Eliot describes this. Marner had a dreamy feeling that this child was somehow a message come to him from a far-off life, It stirred quiverings of tenderness, impressions of awe at some power presiding over his life. We older human beings feel a certain awe in the presence of a little child, such as we feel before some quiet majesty or beauty in earth or sky. Marner took the little girl in his lap, trembling with an emotion mysterious to himself at something unknown dawning on his life. He could only have said that the child was come instead of the gold, or rather that the gold had turned into this child. He named her Epi, and Epi loved sunshine and sounds and everything in creation. The gold had asked that he should sit weaving longer and longer, deafened to all things except the monotony of his loom. But Epi called him away from his weaving and made him think all its pauses a holiday, reawakening his senses with her fresh life, warming him to joy because she had joy. Every time I read this passage, and I've read it to some of you before, I think of Jesus. Like when God came to us, God didn't come as a man with a lot of gold or strength or power. God came as a child, because God knows that a child awakens something in us. It's like a message from a far-off life. It stirs tenderness in us. It awakens us to beauty. A child brings us joy, hope, life. Here's the last thing. I'll close with this. I'll never, for the rest of my life, think about Dorcas without remembering a most remarkable moment when Lisa and I, some others of you who are here in the room, went to Africa. We went to Kenya on a mission trip. We went to see our church's Zoey ministry there. If you don't know what Zoey is, Zoey's like this amazing ministry with all these orphans in Kenya. And what we've done for years is you build an orphanage, and they live in it till they're grown up, and then their life's not really very good. Right? So what Zoey does is Zoey comes to a young person with siblings. They're all orphans, and says, what would you like to be? And he says, a farmer. And instead of saying, well, good luck with that, what we do is he gets his first plow and some seeds, and then he starts working his farm. He has a farmer to mentor him and other people to support him, and then he becomes independent. He's supporting his siblings, then he's helping others. It's just the coolest ministry. It's absolutely so different from what we do, right? We blame the poor. We get angry at the poor people that are different, but here we're empowering them. It's the coolest thing ever, I think. While we were there, we met one of these orphans named Lena. Lena's amazing. She'd opened a store where she sells farm supplies. And she has 3 younger siblings. She's 19 years old. She's taking care of them. She's got them uniforms. They're back in school. She's amazing. What's really amazing about Lena is they have these groups in a town, and they support each other. And Lena is the chaplain to this group. So we were there for a worship service, and Lena preached on Dorcas. It's the most amazing sermon I've ever heard in my life. It was in Swahili. I only know one word of Swahili, Jambo, and I don't think she said Jambo in the course of the sermon. But I understood everything she said, because I knew she was preaching on Dorcas. She started her sermon, and she started stroking some fabric that she had up there. And I said, she's talking about Dorcas making clothing for the poor. But then she just fell on the ground and didn't move. And I thought, well, Dorcas died. There she is. But then she got up and she ran across the room, and this was the people running to get Peter, and she comes back, and they got Peter, and then she's on her knees praying, like they were praying for Dorcas, and then she stood up, and I thought, that's Dorcas came back to life. And there's a really interesting thing that I've observed in my lifetime. If you say to white, middle class, upper class people like us, the dead are raised, we say, like we kind of have a sense of entitlement almost, like, oh, of course I live on. Of course all is well for me forever. But say the dead are raised to people who have lived every day of their life within an inch of death. I saw it happen. She said God raises the dead. They leaped, they shouted, they laughed. It went on and on and on. It's a gift. It's a miracle. It's not something you can manage on your own. It's not something that you deserve. It's God's great gift, the resurrection. Friends, this is Christianity. Is that God has not left us alone. God came in the person of a very young child because God wanted us to be tender God wanted us to care for those that were weak and vulnerable. And that child grew up and was raised from the dead so that death would not be the final word for any of us, and we would know the joy that is in that. And once we know the joy that is in that, you know what we do? We do something that is just so very simple. We do something with our hands. We do good always. We always do good. We always help the poor. What else would we do as the people that God has saved? We always do it, and it's a long, patient work. It's just one stitch, and then another stitch, and then another stitch, and then it becomes this great thing of beauty. This is Christianity. It's a beautiful thing. Thanks be to God.
Hey, thank you for watching, and we hope you got something out of that. If you have any feedback for us, any response that was helpful to you, we would love to hear that. Please let us know. And everything that we put out is free, and we want it to be that way, but if you're able and feel led to support the mission of our church or the cost of providing this online content, here's how to do so.